Hello, and welcome to this presentation. I appreciate you taking the time to start this video. I'm Nicholas McKinster. I have been a PMP for just about 5 years now, mainly working in the nonprofit space. And this presentation was put together as part of the PMI Chicagoland chapter's mentorship program. The topic is private sector and nonprofit project management. Two sides of the same coin. My background is largely in nonprofit, and you always get the sense that nonprofit and private sector or for-profit never really trust another, that there's a lot of distrust, and I think that distrust really stems from a lack of understanding. I think that a lot of project managers have a lot to learn from their compatriots, and I think that there's a real opportunity to learn from different industries and different approaches, and be able to, with that greater understanding, improve our own project management skills and also be able to move between different industries as necessary. So please be sure to take the survey at the end. I have linked a QR code to a SurveyMonkey survey, and that will allow me to know more about what you thought was interesting, what you'd like to hear more about, what you didn't like, want to hear that as well. And if there are other topics you want to hear about more in the future, while this was done as part of a time-bound mentorship program, as this is the final result for it, this is something that I really enjoy doing, and I really am looking forward to doing more in the future. So please do take the time to do that, and I would really appreciate that. So let's get started. Where did this all come from? I talked a little bit about this, but let's go into a little more detail. So very recently, I found myself in the middle of a job search, as we all do in our careers. My background has been almost a decade in nonprofit project management, PMP for 5, and I decided I was really interested in maybe starting to look for private sector or for-profit positions for the first time, moving out of nonprofit. And I immediately noticed when I started looking at job postings, started talking to friends, started interviewing for these roles, how differently project managers really contextualize this work. It sounded like a completely different language. And I realized very quickly that the way I was presenting myself and the way I was really contextualizing these projects wasn't doing me any favors. And it really misunderstood, I think, a lot of what the requirements are and what the approaches are. And by understanding that about for-profit, I began to think more about what I just took for granted about the way that nonprofit projects are run. So that was something that really fascinated me. And at around the same time, I began the PMI Chicagoland chapter's mentorship program, which is a really great program. Really encourage people to look that up if they're in the Chicagoland area. If they are in a different part of the country, look at your local chapter of PMI and see what they offer. I spoke with my mentor about this a lot, Margaret Gonzalez, and she has been an absolutely invaluable resource to me throughout this process. Her background was also somewhat in nonprofit, but she's been in private sector for-profit for quite some time. And that was really helpful to get to meet with her weekly, be able to discuss just ideas and say, this is really how I approach things. But this sounds very different than how you contextualize things. What are the constraints on your project just from the overall business model? And so over the course of several months, I did a tremendous amount of research, both within PMI resources, but in external resources as well from various business magazines, trades, and just talking to people. Listening and finding out more about how they approach things and how they view project management as one facet of their industry. So alluded to it a little bit, but my experience is almost entirely in nonprofit. It's 10 years nonprofit project management experience, mostly focused on projects overseas as a government contractor. It's usually federal government. So the organizations I've tended to work for have been very large, and they've been very aligned with the regulatory environment of the U.S. federal government. So that's what I deal with. And that really has colored my idea of what project management looks like. I've been building these skills and I've been learning from experience. I think that a lot of how we view project management really comes from our experiences as project managers. And so as we gain experience in what has worked and what hasn't worked and how to communicate with people, so much of project management is just talking to people. So as we learn how to communicate and how people think, we're really getting calcified within our own experiences. And so it's so important to kind of shatter that a little bit and look at other areas and to learn more about how they work and why they work the way they do, because things happen for a reason in project management. If things are being done correctly, they happen for a reason. So let's find out why. Let's listen. Let's understand what the rationale is. So my experience has colored a lot of the way I approach things. You know, not every problem is a nail just because you have a hammer. So I think it's really important to understand different approaches, different ideas, and different ways of running operations. So I think, as I talked about, the nonprofit and for-profit or private sector are not monolithic categories. We're going to use private sector and for-profit somewhat interchangeably. I know that there's some differences, but essentially as a category that means non-for-profit. But the organizations that I've worked for have largely been very, very large organizations with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of budget. And those organizations, those nonprofits, are going to operate very, very differently than a small community-based nonprofit with a staff of 5 or 10 people. In the same way, the for-profit organizations, if you have Walmart or Procter and Gamble or these very large corporations, are going to operate very differently than a family-owned restaurant down the street. There are going to be some similarities in the way that they contextualize the work they do and their cash flow and what they consider successful and not successful in a quarter. But there are going to be big differences between that. So I think it's really important not to just say, oh, all for-profit are this way or all not-for-profit are this way. There are a lot of distinctions within these categories. So organizational size and funding source may make more of a difference in how an organization operates than whether it's legally classified as a nonprofit or for-profit. So a government contractor is going to operate differently from a foundation, and a small business is going to potentially be more similar to a community nonprofit. You may have small nonprofits that are essentially startups that have 3 or 4 people dealing with hyper-specific issues, working in an almost consulting-like structure, and what they view as important on a quarterly basis and the way that they contextualize their projects is going to be really similar to a tech startup, to its 3 or 4 people working on really disruptive, focused areas, maybe looking to scale up. So there's a lot of differentiation within these groups. So I think that's really the first step. And that's always the first great step whenever understanding anything is whatever seems simple is always more complicated. There's always more facets to it than we originally thought. So they're not monolithic categories. So be clear about that when you're looking at for-profit or nonprofit. Say, what kind of organization is this? Is this going to be a contractor? Is this a foundation? Is this a small community-based organization? Is it a small business? Is it a multinational corporation? Is it a startup? Because that's really going to color how they view their projects. So think about it that way. What kind of organization is this? Ask yourself that first.
And a big part of that is going to be how they're going to contextualize what success is. And a big part of that is going to be who holds the purse strings, who really is determining this, who are the important people that you need to make happy in order for a project to be successful and for a business to be successful. And so I've broken it down into 3 broad-ish categories: stakeholders, shareholders, and private companies. These are very, very broad. Stake, and all the terms are going to be maybe slightly different than you see in the PMBOK, but essentially it's going to be the same thing. We all know what stakeholders are. And I use stakeholders when describing nonprofit specifically, because in a nonprofit situation, your stakeholders are going to be incredibly diverse. They're going to be incredibly broad, and they're all going to want things that are incredibly contradictory based on their own experiences. And a large part of navigating a nonprofit project management is understanding who actually has the authority to determine whether a project is successful or not. Because all these people do need to be happy, but all of them are going to tell you what needs to happen, and you need to understand exactly who you need to be listening to and what percent of their say is going to make it to the final product. But you can't just eliminate something because they don't have a formal role, because a large part of the projects that are being done are really supposed to benefit a really wide swath of people and communities. And so it's important to listen to all of those communities, and you can't just write them off. So stakeholders will have radically diverse needs, which are often contradictory. So as an example, again, from my own experience, we all uh, color the world through our own experiences. When dealing with a local situation, let's say an African country where you're working on a project with hospitals, you're going to have to deal with the contractors at the hospital. They're actually carrying out the work. You're going to have to deal with the doctors at the hospital who are dealing with the results of these work day to day. You're going to have to deal with the managers at the hospital, the admin at the hospital. You're going to have to deal with the local government officials, with the national government officials, with the in-country U.S. government officials that you have to deal with the U.S.-based U.S. government officials, with international organizations, with religious and social organizations that are active in the area. All of them are important stakeholders. Any one of them, through concerted effort, have the ability to sync a project, especially in the nonprofit world where optics are so important. So it's crucial, and I think a really, really important part of nonprofit project management is that everybody needs to be happy to a certain extent. You can't just prioritize certain outcomes and say, as long as we can get to this outcome, people will be happy. The needs are often too contradictory. It's and because people aren't necessarily throwing in their own money, um, they're going to say what they really think. They're going to take really pure stances. They're going to die on hills, and you're going to have to deal with all of these incredibly diverse, incredibly contradictory ideas. So that's stakeholders, and that's how I view in the aspect for nonprofit. So shareholders, they're valuing profitability and efficiency. They're going to be activist investors. They're going to be people that disagree about how things should be achieved. But at the end of the day, if the business is profitable and is efficient, and quarter over quarter you're seeing growth, you're seeing things moving in the right direction, it gets harder and harder for people to be able to say, I think you're not doing things right if the results are speaking for themselves. So to a certain extent, it's not that you can disregard stakeholders, but it's that there is such a firm external shared goal that really the debate is how to get there. How do we end up where we need to be? How do we get profitable? So as long as if something you end up being profitable, that solves a lot of questions. That answers a lot of questions. Um, I know in sports they always say when you're winning, when your team is winning, that solves all your internal problems. It's the same thing in a business. If you're profitable, it's going to calm down your stakeholders. They may not like everything, but if they're making money off it and their investment is moving in the right direction, they're going to see projects as successful. And so then a kind of twist to that is private organizations. They're going to value profit. Obviously, they need to stay sustainable, but they're going to be a little less reliant on market performance. They're going to be able to potentially prioritize more principled stands, certain ways of working with employees, of working with communities, maybe longer term projects that they can take longer to come to fruition. They don't need to be able to have to answer questions every single quarter to quite the same level as a publicly traded company is going to. Publicly traded companies are going to get raked over the coals every single quarter about what's happening. You have a great plan that's not going to be profitable for 4 years. We're not going to have a company in 4 years if you're not profitable. So that those are really different needs and different this baseline requirements for who is having a say and who's having an input on what these final outcomes for projects are going to be. And it really changes the way that project managers and organizations approach projects based on who's actually determining whether this is successful or not. So how is success defined? And this is something I thought was really, really, really interesting when I started talking to people, that I think there's such a huge difference in the way that for-profit and nonprofit organizations view success for a project, that this is, I think, one of the key points for distrust. Um, In a nonprofit organization, and this is something I've seen over and over and over again, projects are intended to fully spend all available money because their goal is to do the most of a certain type of work. Their projects are often long term. You're not going to solve the problem by the end of this project. You're just trying to move the needle a little bit in an incredibly difficult situation. You're dealing with really complicated problems, dealing with really difficult places, and you're trying to solve these issues as best as you can. But it's not going to be a solution. It's going to be moving the needle. So that's really what's seen as success is moving the needle. And so to that extent, if you say we're going to be able to carry out these tasks, it's going to cost us this amount of money in the budget, um, and you get them done beforehand, then the answer will be, well, your plan should have been budgeted differently. We said we had $10 million for this project. You did it in 8. Then you need to make a bigger project. Then you needed to more fully, and we want you to be efficient. You have to follow these rules, but you need to spend that full 10 million. You're coming in 2 million under. You need to figure out what to do. Maybe you can get a no cost extension, but there are going to be real questions about if you're coming in way under budget. I mean, was that an implementation issue? Was that a budget issue? And then when you're submitting bids in the future, they're going to say, I don't think these guys really know how their budgets go. I mean, look at their last project. They had all millions of dollars left on the table. If we had kicked that in earlier in the project, that might have had an exponential increase in output later on. So unseen money is seen as poor in implementation and bad budget tracking. Ideally, the last penny is spent on your last payment as you close out the project. And this is incredibly complicated because you're dealing with potentially budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars. And there's just an expectation that you are going to be hitting that right on the dot, that you are budgeting that carefully. And you need to do that consistently. And those are really the expectations. So you have to spend all your money. And I know that it's very, very difficult because it seems inefficient, but it's only inefficient if you're looking at projects through a for-profit lens. And a nonprofit lens, if you have extra money, it means you could have done more of the work. You could have pushed that needle a little bit further towards the solution. And so then in a private sector, in a for-profit organization, they carry out projects which minimize costs while maximizing revenue. Goal is going to be profit, not spending all of the money to maximize project output. So if your goal is to hit a certain sales figure and you're given this budget to achieve that, if you're able to hit that sales figure or exceed that sales figure and save money, that's great. Then that is a good project. That is a successful project. And in a for-profit environment, it is because the quarter-to-quarter profitability of an organization is so important. These projects, you're not looking for incremental improvement over a period of years. You're looking at, we need to pay salaries now. We need to be profitable now. Because if we're not, this business is going to go under. We don't have any long-term plans here. We need to pay the rent. There's no guaranteed funding for 4 or 5 years. If people stop buying your product, your funding's gone. And so you need to be constantly turning that funding to keep yourself solvent. And so for a private sector organization, that efficiency, doing things under budget, that's a huge valuable element, rather than being seen as, we gave you all of this money to do as much of this type of work as possible. Why didn't you do more? Why do you have extra money sitting around? You're not going to finish all of the work that you want to do. Why aren't you doing more? So I think that's a really, really important distinction. I think that this difference here is one of the main areas where you see private sector or for-profit and not-for-profit project managers really get distrustful of one another, because you see it as, look how inefficient that is. They never come in under budget. They're always spending right up to the dollar. That's wasteful. I mean, they could absolutely cut all these costs and do that same work for less, rather than they're trying to do the max amount of work. And if you did manage to cut costs, then that means you just get to use that cheaper rate to do more. Versus the nonprofit, you're saying, look, I mean, they're looking for minimal viability. They don't care if this is as good as it could be. they want to make, as long as they're making money and as long as they are maximizing revenue, they don't really care. And that's because the priorities in private sector are solvency and keeping up momentum and market momentum, and they have to. It's not a choice. Um, and it's absolutely fascinating to see these two really different approaches. And I think that it really changes how you view projects. And as a result of those differences, you start to see a real difference in the way that timelines work for project success. So, in general, these nonprofit projects are going to be at least a year, if not more. Large government projects uh, generally are 5 years. Um, they're incredibly long, and there may be follow-ons to them. Um, and people are guaranteed funding for those 5 years because the idea is we don't really know what's going to be happening over this period of time. And so it's really important that we're able to respond to the changing landscape. We don't know if it's public health, if it's uh, freedom of press. We don't know what could be happening politically, socially, economically over this period of time. We need to be able to adapt. We need to be able to respond to these things. Um, it's really, really crucial. So you have guaranteed funding for this really long period of time. So you have the luxury of saying, okay, well, in the first year, we're not maybe going to do a whole lot. We're building momentum. We're building the base. We're building this foundation so we can really build on it. And in the long term, even after the project's over after 5 years, the the good that we're doing and the result of what we're doing is going to have ramifications um, past those that 5 year time period. But in for profit, you don't have that luxury. You need to generate revenue quickly enough that a business is solvent. Um, it doesn't matter if a project is going to eventually be profitable. Um, it's going to shut down before that point. If you say, with first year, we're going to lay the groundwork. Um, we're going to make sure it's a good base, and then we're maybe second year will be profitable, maybe third year. There are some small businesses where that's the case, where they have to do that, and you have to plan for that. And there's definitely a point where if you're not profitable, you're going to go under. You need to be solvent. You can't just run a non-profitable business or an unprofitable business perpetually, because you're going to run out of money. You're not going to be able to pay your bills. You're going to run out of whatever your savings are. There are, of course, some major exceptions to this, and I think a big thing that we're seeing a lot now with venture capital firms and with tech startups, where you have non-profitable businesses or businesses that are not turning a profit for a very long period of time, that are being propped up by external investment with the idea that they might become profitable one day. And I'd say most of them don't, realistically. Maybe a technology comes out of it. Maybe they pivot to something completely different. But in general, VC works very differently. But I do think it's funny that I think that the venture capital model is potentially closest to a lot of what you see in nonprofit, where you say, yeah, you haven't been profit, you haven't really done a whole lot in this year or next year, but you're building the base. You're building this really interesting approach. You're designing saying it's going to take years to come to fruition. And if you didn't have this external support, you wouldn't be able to build that. But you're going to be able to, because of this external funding, because you have that longer time period. So I think that you see very different time frames. You see much longer time frames with nonprofits. You're just trying to move the needle over 5, 10, 15 years, just a little bit, make things a little bit better, solve the problem just a little bit. Whereas with for-profit, it's, we need to pay the bills this quarter. What's our income this quarter? Can we cover that? What about next quarter? Do we have momentum? Um, how is that working? And I think that that's a really, really important distinction between nonprofit and for-profit organizations. So let's look more closely at specific elements of for-profit project management. So if the primary goal is going to be short-term profit, is we're making as much money as you can now, you don't know what's going to come tomorrow, you don't know what's going to come next quarter, how can we make things happen now? How does this affect projects? And the big thing, we talked about this a little bit, long-term success cannot come at the expense of short-term performance. You need to have long-term success. You want to build a brand. You want to build a long-term plan, but you need to be successful now. There's a greater focus on outcomes than process. There isn't okay, well, if we do things correctly, we're building this foundation. It's we need to be profitable. We need to be successful. We need to be able to stand on our own 2 feet. Because if we can't do that now, we're not going to make it 2 years. We're not going to make it 5 years. We need to be successful now. So you have that really crucial short-term element there. And because of that, there's a focus on outcomes. It doesn't really matter how we get there. We can do whatever we need to. There's not important. No one's going to be complaining about our process. If they like the product and we're able to be profitable, they're going to be okay with that. As long as it's legal, for the most part, we'll be fine. And I think another thing that I've noticed that's really interesting is that because of that really crucial short-term edge, that you need every little advantage you can get to remain successful and remain solvent and be able to hold yourself up, that people at private sector for-profit organizations are really, really interested in every single advantage they can get, every single minuscule edge they can get on competitors. They will take. And because of that, you see business trends popping up and being adopted more quickly at for-profits than you do at nonprofits. Nonprofit project management, the way they operate, and the ideas that they're using are years behind what you see in the private sector or for-profit communities. So things like Agile, ERPs, really basic things that you see in corporate America for a very long time. These are just starting to really come in large nonprofits. Small nonprofits, not at all. Because in the for-profit world, you need every edge you can get. And that's not something you really see in the nonprofit world. There's not really, there are competitors, but at the end of the day, you're there for trying to achieve a goal. And maybe you bring different approaches to it, but there will be other work. And you're not really competing for market share quite the same way as you are where if you don't, your product, your approach isn't better than your competitors, you're going to be out of business. So looking at nonprofit, moving towards a long-term goal through short-term action with a focus on mission. I think it's another thing that's really important is this focus on mission, that in the for-profit world, there are ideas about companies having principles or ideas or the standing for something. And I think that's true to some point. I think some, especially smaller businesses or family-owned businesses, are obviously going to care in certain ways. But a lot of that is really going to be based on maintaining profitability. They don't really have the luxury of being able to make decisions that they say, well, this is the right thing to do. But unfortunately, our profit's gone and we're going to go out of business. No one's dying on that hill. No one is going to do that. However, with nonprofits, it's absolutely crucial to have your optics be perfect. You need to show that you're on mission. You need to always be appearing to do the right thing. So short-term actions are seen as slow progress. You're moving that needle we keep talking about towards a larger goal. There's going to be less pressure on short-term results. They need to be there. But if you can talk about this as, oh, this is moving towards a final goal, a final position, then you'll be okay. As long as that needle's still moving, as long as you're sticking with your plans, as long as you're following the rules and showing you're being as efficient and equitable and fair as you can in your procurement and your processes, there's going to be a lot of leeway as to exactly how much growth and how much success you can have. It's really going to be dependent on too many external factors, and you're not really going to be held to the grindstone on that. And because of that, there's going to be a greater focus on process than outcomes. It's important that when you're going in and you're trying to solve problems, you're not just throwing money at it, that you're building these equitable processes that are genuinely helping people and building long-term success. The outcome, you're going to get there eventually, but in doing that, you can't wreck the situation. You can't wreck the societal position. You can't wreck the country you're going into to try to create this result. You need to do it in a way that is positive. And so every single step needs to pass all of these, litmus tests about whether or not it's being done the right way. And because of that, I think that's where another one of these ideas of nonprofits being inefficient are, is because all of these steps have to pass all of these tests, because any one of those will doom the entire project. Then suddenly, you're using unequitable procurement. You're using you're not doing these processes in ways that are going to genuinely help the community in the long term. And maybe your outcome, if it's an infectious disease, maybe you're stopping the infectious disease, or you're making your goals along your timeline. But if you're doing it in a way that's going to harm the community long term, that's not going to be seen as successful. You can't just point to your outcomes and say, yeah, we did the right thing. You have to get outcomes, but you need to do it in a way that that process is going to be sustainable and that isn't going to cause harm. And because of that, there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through. And so work is focused on a particular approach to address a societal problem. And so that can change over time. So as we talked about in the previous point, your process needs to be fair. It needs to be seen as genuinely helpful to the community. What is being determined to be genuinely helpful to the community changes over time. What is seen as the right way to do things changes over time. So as societal norms change, as funding mechanisms change, the way that work is being done change. A really great example of that in the 90s, a lot of foreign aid was done through something that's now derisively described as parachute development, where essentially you would send in a small number of high-paid Western consultants. They would work on a problem for a little bit, and then they would leave. They would parachute in, fix the problem, and then leave immediately. Uh, that didn't really help, because a lot of the times, as soon as they leave, they haven't really built a system that is going to be self-sustaining in the long term. Nobody there was really taught anything. No one there was a stakeholder. They didn't really talk about what they needed and how to integrate these solutions with what society actually, how it was built, what their needs were, what their wants were. It was really this external view of what success was. There was no real, it wasn't seen as crucial to have local buy-in in the same way. And so now you're seeing an incredible amount of localization, where would it be more efficient to have an international organization come in and build a lot of these processes? I mean, possibly, in the short term, but in the long term, building the capacity of local organizations that live there, that work there, that know the realities of their situation better than someone from New York City, um, you're going to get better results in the long term. So you're seeing this incredible focus switch towards localization. Um, and that's going to really change. So your companies would need to switch. That if you're still operating a company that is operating based on the ethics of what is seen as best from the 1990s in 2025, that's going to put you in a position where you're not going to get bids. You're going to be seen as woefully outdated, because optics and process is more important than necessarily the immediate outcomes. And something we talked about a little bit earlier about smaller nonprofits sharing similarities with early stage startups. You have a small staff, very consulting focused. They're able to pivot, radically low overhead. They may be entirely remote. And I think you're starting to see this more and more because so many of the problems are hyper niche. And the approaches are hyper niche. And we're seeing increased use of AI, increased use of tech, increased use of all sorts of approaches that you really need this very specific skill set for. Because of that, it's easier to have a very small, agile organization that can hop around and solve those sorts of issues, can build those sorts of systems. Might be more helpful than a very large, unwieldy organization that has a lot of people, but it can't really adapt to what the latest needs are. So it's been a whole lot, and I appreciate if you are still listening. I know it's been over a half hour, but what are the takeaways? What did I really learn from this, and what did you learn from this? Um, what I learned, for instance, is for-profits don't see themselves as for-profits or private sector. If you go to an organization and ask them about themselves, they're not going to say, "Oh yeah, we're the largest for-profit organization in Chicago." They're going to say, "We are the Midwest number one axle grease distributor with a focus on online distribution." That's their niche. That's what they do. And I think in the way that nonprofit gets really lumped together, like, oh, I've worked in nonprofit for 10 years. No one, no one really questions that. I think when I introduced myself that way at the beginning of the presentation, unless you worked in nonprofit, I think very few of you would have asked, well, what kind of nonprofit? Like, what does that mean? That could mean a lot. It means you worked at the YMCA like for a decade, or were you a government contractor? Like, it can mean very many different things. Um, but I think that there's a tendency to really lump that all together in a way that for profit doesn't. So immediately, if you're going to be in interviews, you don't want to be like, oh, I don't want to be a nonprofit anymore. I want to work for the private sector. They don't care. That doesn't mean anything to them. All they hear when you say that is, I am my brain is still in the nonprofit sector. That is all I know. That is all I'm going to know. So uh, don't do that. Understand the businesses, apply to them for a reason for their particular industry and business niche. Know what they do, why they do it, how they do it, what makes them special, what's their focus. Not even just, I want to work for a financial organization. Well, what's this financial organization? What makes them different than the other ones? Are they focused on high net worth individuals? Do they have a broad range of consumer banking? Or do they have the best online platforms? Um, that's what you need to know. So go in talking about the particular business, not broad industries. You can't make those same sorts of jumps that you can often, or that's much more common with nonprofits. Um, One thing that I ran into that was really difficult when I was applying for jobs outside of the nonprofit world was how to make my resume look like a resume of someone who's been not in nonprofits. Um, we don't really have tangible, quantifiable monetary results of most of our actions. Even project managers who are really in the nitty gritty details, they're not going to be able to say, "Oh, well, I saved this amount of money," or "Oh, I did this." Those aren't the stats that are being tracked, and people aren't going to care about the stats that are being tracked because they're going to be so in the weeds, technical, that they're not going to translate to anything. So what you really need to do is you need to look at what you did and you need to break it down into quantifiable business cases. Look at successes. What did you do? Look at your nonprofit. Did you mitigate risk? Okay. What was the total value? What was the monthly burn rate of that project? How much money do you think you saved by the actions you took? And you need to be able to defend that. Obviously, you're not fabricating this. You're not just making it up out of thin air, but you do need to creatively look at the work you did and assign numbers to things that originally weren't going to have quantifiable dollar values assigned to them. So you need to be able to come up with explanations for the actions that you had, and how they fit into a for-profit environment. So talk about them. I mean, make sure they're good, make sure they're clear, and make sure that you believe them. Make sure that they're real. So when they come up in interviews, you can be excited and say, "Yeah, I did save $100 million because I caught these issues. And if they hadn't been caught, we would have had to go back and redo half of the project. I mean, our total value was this amount. This is what our monthly burn rate was. We would have been delayed 3 months if I hadn't caught this issue. And so that saved us this $50 million. That's what you need to be able to do, and you need to really really understand it. You need to know your project. So even if you're not planning on making a shift from nonprofit to a different industry, start trying to think about your work a little bit in that way. Start trying to understand it a little bit that way so you can understand it a little bit better. Be prepared to discuss why you want to change sectors. You won't get asked this in every interview, but you will sometimes get asked that. For me, when you sit down in an interview, at a financial institution and you have 10 years of nonprofit experience, they're going to ask you, why don't you want to be a nonprofit anymore? Or what's wrong with that? Aren't we the bad guys? Um, and there isn't a right answer to that question. Um, but there are a lot of wrong answers. So think about it genuinely. Why do you want to work for not in the nonprofit sector? Why do you want to work for this particular company? And answer the question that way. This isn't a why don't you want to be a nonprofit? It's a why do you want to work for this company specifically? It's that same question, just phrased a little differently. Be ready for that. Talk to people about it, and make sure you have a strong answer ready. And finally, lean on your credentials. This whole presentation was done through the Project Management Institute, through their mentorship program, through Chicagoland chapter. I cannot say enough how valuable my PMP has been. PMP is incredibly useful. Credentials are incredibly useful. They will, at the very least, get your foot in the door. People will know, okay, this person knows the verbiage. They know how to contextualize ideas. They know the forms we're going to be using. That they're really going to be able to step right in, at least broadly, even if maybe their experience is in a slightly different industry. That so lean on your credentials, believe in your credentials, trust in your credentials, and when you're describing what you did, use the wording from those credentials because that's they're gonna be able to better understand that. Maybe your industry is different, but if you're using those PMBOK phrases and words and ideas to describe the work you did, you're absolutely going to be able to get people who understand you, and that's really the key. Both it's interviewing and in project management generally is being understood. When you say something, having someone really know what you mean. So finally, feedback and thoughts. Thank you so much for sitting through this. I really, really appreciate it. I hope that you have some interesting ideas, I hope you learned something. If you didn't learn something, I hope that you at least engaged with your own ideas through this. Please feel free to email me at namckinster@gmail.com or take the survey linked at the QR code on the screen right now. This will take you to a short, I think, 6-question survey. This will give you really an opportunity to let me know what you think. I would love for this to be a back and forth conversation. I'm sure I said some things you don't agree with. And that's good. That's what we want. We want this conversation. So please send me your thoughts either in the survey or if you have more detail, you want to write me a rant, please do. I want to hear what you genuinely think. And if there's something you liked and you potentially want to see more webinars like this in the future, send me your topics, send me ideas, things that you really are interested in, that you want to learn more about, or that you just want to talk about too. And I would be absolutely thrilled to do more of these in the future. So again, I'm Nicholas McKinster. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.